Hey guys, Crippen Governor from the Gut Health Gurus podcast. I've got a background in food science, and today I'm so blessed. I've got someone on the podcast that I've been meaning to speak to for some time. One of the world leaders in the space of fermented foods and the actual evidence-based information around fermented foods. And a lot of the times, people could be a little bit skeptical about the benefits of fermented food. So what I wanted to do is get someone who's an expert and who's at the cutting edge of the science to break it down for us on the podcast today. Adjunct Professor Paul Cotter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Crippen. It's a real pleasure to be here. I only hope that I can do justice to that fantastic introduction.
I'm sure you will. I'm a huge fan of your work. I've actually been deeply diving into a paper that you wrote or you co-wrote with a couple of your colleagues from Cork University, APC, Microbiome, the microbiota and health promoting characteristics of the fermented beverage kefir. So I really wanted to have a deep dive into your work on fermented foods. And so that's the kind of frame for today. But at the start of every podcast, I like to get it from the horse's mouth. Who is Paul Cotter?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm a microbiologist, and that's not just my job. I'm a scientific nerd. I love what I do. I gravitated towards microbiology from university and haven't stopped since. I guess we'll be talking a lot about microbiology and fermented foods over the next while, so I won't linger too much on that for now. But I'm a dad. I have 3 kids ranging from 23 down to 16. I like sport a lot. I help coach my son's Gaelic football team, so our equivalent of Aussie rules. I like to run. I've done a few marathons. But outside of work and outside of those things, I think science is my hobby and it's my passion. I used to really enjoy going into the lab and having that eureka moment, taking out that agar plate and seeing the next cool result. Unfortunately, as time was moved on, I kind of became more of a manager or a head of a lab. I don't get that direct kick or that eureka moment any longer, but I live vicariously through my students who do fantastic work on fermented foods, and that's what keeps me passionate and keeps me enthusiastic about what I do.
Wonderful. And I can certainly see from all those interests that you mentioned during that beautiful introduction on who you are, on why you potentially chose this field, because you mentioned you mentioned microbiology, which lends itself to all the work that you do on the microbiome, on fermented foods. You mentioned sports, which you've done a whole lot of work on the impact of sports and the microbiome, and also testing poo samples from sports people, which I'm sure we're going to dive into at some point. But what fascinates you about microbiology? Why have you gravitated towards that field?
I think it's something that's become more apparent to the general public in recent years, and that is that microbes contribute so much to what we do in everyday life, to our health, to disease, and not only in relation to food, but at the moment we're being exposed to infection and discussion in relation to viruses. But there's a lot of things that microbes can do that are health promoting through probiotics and whatnot as well. So I guess I started my microbiology work focusing on a food pathogen, Listeria. So Listeria monocytogenes can cause people to get sick. It's especially a problem for pregnant women and people with weak immune systems. So I spent 4 years studying how it survives in foods and how to develop countermeasures to stop that. That then evolved into focusing on good bacteria that are in fermented foods and in other sources that produce not antibiotics, but kind of natural sources of antibiotics that are more target specific. They kill the bad guys, but don't do so much damage or don't do any damage to your own natural microbiota. So spent quite a lot of time on that, and then evolved to looking at broader microbial communities and how they contribute to health as well, how they interact with one another. And so it was a logical process. But I think once I started a course in university that involved being exposed to lots of different aspects of science, zoology, plant science, biochemistry, microbiology. But as soon as I had my first microbiology lecture, I was won over. I was immediately convinced that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
I can say hand on heart, you're certainly a kindred spirit, because when I think back in my food science studies, and again, having a broad range of different topics involved in chemistry and biology, but my number one passion was microbiology. It's interesting. I actually started my university journey in computer science, and
Okay.
I actually took up electives in microbiology while I was studying computers, because I just loved it so much. And then eventually I said, why am I doing this computer stuff? I'm just going to jump to a different degree altogether. And I jumped into food science, which is heavily into the microbiology. So definitely a kindred soul, my friend Paul.
Great
So
stuff.
how do we start this? I think we've got to deal with the elephant in the room. And we're going through this because you mentioned viruses, right? And so I'm thinking about this massive elephant. We're going through this extraordinary time where the world is in panic and fear with this COVID-19 situation. So what's your thoughts on what's going on, Paul? What's happening in your neck of the woods, and what's your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah. So I guess the things have accelerated in Ireland in recent days. So we're kind of a little bit behind the hotspots in Europe, which are Italy and Spain. But once it became apparent that things were getting serious there, that our government have shown great leadership, I think. So they have closed down the schools and the universities quite quickly. I'm based at Teagasc, which is a wing of the Irish Department of Agriculture and Food. So we're still operating, but at a very much reduced capacity. And where people can operate from home, they're encouraged to do so. The number of deaths or the number of cases are up to around, I think it's 350, 400 now, and 2 deaths, unfortunately, so far. But there's very strong messaging in terms of social distancing. Elderly people encouraged to stay at home as much as possible. I think people have been very good to support one another, and there's lots of activity on social media and other resources to show that people are willing to back one another up and to make sure that we come through this successfully. So it's a tough time. Lots of people are very nervous. I think it's an important time for scientists to be clear in terms of their messaging, because it's clear that through some social outlets that some rumors and false news is circulating, and so it's important that doesn't enter too strongly into the public consciousness, and that scientists enter the fray quite quickly to try to show what the real science out there is. And it's been interesting, in fact, in the UK, looking at it from across the Irish Sea, whereby I think their policy attracted quite a lot of concern from scientists initially, and the scientific community there, through social media and through other means, through BBC and other outlets, have been able to get their point out there and to convince the British government that maybe their initial approach wasn't the correct one. And now I think finally they're starting in the UK to close schools and to really kind of put in place the more extreme measures that are needed in order to prevent spread of the disease.
I'm really sorry to hear about the situation there. And Paul, just for your information, it's a very, very similar situation here in Australia. The borders are closing, a lot of social distancing, very similar. It's an extremely challenging time for all of us. And that's a good segue to explore the microbiology aspects, because it's very easy to jump to, that the microbes are bad. They're bad things. You know what I mean? Like it's part of nature. And I think with this COVID situation, it's the immune system that really is killing us. It's the overreaction of the immune system. I mean, there's viruses. There's tens of thousands of viruses in us, around us. They're everywhere. it's just unfortunate that there's this one particular one that's causing these issues. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess it's the microbes that, just like in everyday news, it's the bad news that'll attract the headlines. And so you don't always hear about the good deed or the good work that's going on behind the scenes. And in that regard, there are as many microbes that are doing good things and very many more that are just harmless that are out there, but so they tend to receive less attention. And I think that's probably something that's reflective of, just to some extent, what's happened in Western society for quite some length of time, in that I think fermented foods and other beneficial microbes probably weren't appreciated so much and fell out of favor. They continue to be consumed in certain parts of the world. But now, in the last number of years, because I think of a greater consciousness of gut health and of the microbiome, that people are now aware and conscious that they need to be eating the right foods and be exposed to good microbes early in life to prevent the development of allergies and such like. And by doing that, you can give your body a better chance to cope when it is exposed to the bad guys, which undoubtedly everybody will encounter to some extent or another during their life.
Yeah, and that's a common thread that you see through the research, where there's this almost like this hygiene hypothesis that formed, in our approach in society, whether it's through the food industry. The food industry is classic, in terms of having to nuke the life out of the food product. Whether it's through a very rigorous canning process, where you're running F noughts at 6. People probably won't understand that. I think Paul would understand. So it's really high temperature, time 121 degrees plus, nuking it, killing everything, and literally having a very sterile food. It's the same thing we see with pasteurization, where you're literally just trying to kill bacteria. But I think the food industry eventually will transition to a new paradigm where we are actually using microbes to potentially produce things like that you mentioned, Paul, whether they're antimicrobial compounds or whether you're using it as a crowding strategy. So is that something that's in your sphere as well, in your thinking process?
Yeah, I agree. I suppose from the food industry's perspective, it's safest, or they don't have to worry about spoilage or shelf life if they nuke something, as you say, by canning it or essentially sterilizing it so that the food has a long shelf life. There's no chance of it getting spoiled or anybody ever getting sick from it. And so that's the safest thing from their perspective, but it's not always the best thing in terms of consuming food. I do think it is important to be able to preserve foods in a way that will keep it safe. So pasteurization is useful and is important, because raw milk can make very many people very sick depending on their again, their immune status and so on. So we do need to be conscious of how we preserve food, but people for millennia have been preserving food and doing it very well through the act of fermentation. And so it's not coincidence that very many societies around the world have produced fermented foods. And it's not just because in that case that they liked the flavor or they were conscious of their gut microbiota. It was just purely because they had a particular product that they had in vast quantities in certain times of the year, but which had a short shelf life. And so they weren't able to preserve it and to consume it months later. And so in several cases, by fluke or by coincidence, they came across a process whereby, for example, milk was fermented to make cheese or some other fermented food product, which meant that it had a much longer shelf life. And so while milk wasn't available, they could still consume the cheese much later. And that same principle is true for fish, fermented grains, and all sorts of other fermented foods as well. And so, in essence, what's happening there is the microbes that are in the food, the good microbes, are producing lactic acid or some other sort of metabolite that is lowering the pH or increasing the pH or doing something to it that's making the food inhospitable for the bad guys or for the spoilage microbes. And by killing them, the food lasts much longer. And I think in recent years, then we've come to appreciate that not only does it preserve the food, but quite often it introduces new flavors, it reduces or removes allergens, it produces metabolites and other things that when you consume them have beneficial impacts on the gut and on your gut microbiome and on your immune system and whatnot. But it really is something that we've been doing for thousands of years without necessarily fully appreciating the intricacies of what's underlying all of those processes.
Yeah, that's beautifully articulated, Paul. There's one point I want to dig in a little bit deeper because I haven't actually heard anybody talk about that before. How does the fermentation process remove allergens?
Yeah, so in that regard, so the simplest example there is for people who are lactose intolerant. So if you're consuming milk, there's lactose in there, and so you can't consume lactose. You'll have side effects on muscle and stomach cramping and so on and so forth. But if you have the right microbes in a fermentation process in a yogurt or a cheese manufacturer, if those microbes very efficiently convert lactose to lactate, then individuals can consume the product because the lactose is no longer present. And so that's the simplest example. And yogurt has a health claim in relation to that particular activity. But there are other things as well, in that there are other allergens present in dairy products or in quite a few different plant-based products. The raw materials can have materials in them that some people's bodies don't cope well with consuming, but by virtue of the microbes growing in them, they can break down those products and produce either beneficial or at least neutral byproducts that allows us to consume those foods effectively then.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of a study I saw recently around sourdough and gluten, about potentially how going through that lactate fermentation process, maybe the gluten is a little bit easier for the body to digest, something along
Yeah,
those lines. Other
that's a very
examples,
good example as well. Yeah.
other examples of the, perhaps not in a context of allergens, but maybe for anti-nutrient compounds, things like phytic acid or things of that nature could lend itself to being fermented and reducing the impact in the gut.
Yeah, perfect examples. Yeah,
Something.
so I guess there are probably other things that people aren't even aware of that they might have potential allergies to, but that are being removed from fermented foods. So those are the classic examples, but I don't doubt that there are others out there as well.
Yeah. So what's exactly, for people that might be totally new to fermentation, what is going on in the fermentation process?
Okay, so it might be simplest to pick one particular example because there's lots of different twists and variations on a theme. But so one of the fermented foods that we study most frequently here is kefir, milk kefir. And
Mhm.
so kefir is contained, kefir is made from kefir grains. And kefir grains are communities of different microbes that are grouped together in kind of a polysaccharide matrix. So it looks a little bit like a small cauliflower of this size. But it's not from plant-based, it's used for dairy fermentations. And so within the kefir, you have the bacteria and yeast all kind of clumped together, living happily in combination with one another. And for the fermentation process, what you do is you take your milk, so whatever source of milk you like, cow's milk, goat milk, whatever, you add the kefir grain to it. And some of the microbes that are present there like the milk environment, so they leave the kefir grain and they begin growing in the milk. They grow in conjunction with one another and they encourage one another's growth, and they have all sorts of different synergistic activities between one another. So the primary activity involves the growth of lactic acid bacteria. So things like particularly lactococcus. So lactococcus takes the lactose in the milk, the sugar source, and converts that to lactic acid. And thereby you have your first advantage immediately, as I described previously, whereby the production of lactic acid, it drops the pH, makes the milk slightly more acidic, not so acidic that it's harmful to us, but acidic enough that it stops the spoilage microbes and the disease-causing microbes from growing. Lactic acid is particularly good in this regard. And after it grows, the lower pH facilitates the growth of other microbes, so things like lactobacillus and different types of lactobacillus like plantarum or Keephanophacians or Lactobacillus kefiri. And those are notable because their lactobacilli are kind of first cousins of other lactobacilli that you find very frequently in probiotic products. So lots of different strains of lactobacillus have been associated with health attributes. So these microbes contribute to flavor, but also when we consume them, contribute to health. And then they also produce other metabolites like kefiran, which is a polysaccharide, which is thought to be a prebiotic. And a prebiotic is distinct from a probiotic in that a prebiotic, when you consume it, is used as a nutrient source for the good microbes in your gut as well. And then you have lots of other microbes like leuconostoc, which contributes to flavor. You have yeasts, which can contribute to the kind of distinctive, gassy, kind of bubbly nature of some types of kefir. Less is known about how they contribute to health, but I don't doubt that they're important. And so all of those different microbes exist, and there's kind of a wave of growth whereby certain microbes dominate after the first few hours, and then others begin to grow and take off. And that's the reason why some people like to consume their kefir after a relatively short fermentation process, and others longer, because as it goes on longer, the flavor becomes more intense and more considerable. So it depends on your palate. And at the end of that process, you remove the kefir grain again, you sieve it off or just decant it. You put the kefir grain back into fresh milk to begin the process all over again, and you consume the milk and you gain the associated benefits. And I suppose we can get into it in more detail as we go on, but that process reflects maybe the kefir grain that I have in my kitchen at home, but it might vary subtly from the one that you have in your house or that somebody has in San Francisco or London and so on and so forth. So we're doing a lot of things like surveying different kefirs and also different other types of fermented foods around the world to see how they differ. And we know, for example, from that, there are certain kefirs where you have a community that is good for, say, removing cholesterol, but that might be only 2 out of every 15 kefirs. And so I wouldn't necessarily know if I have the right kefir at home unless I do a study on it. And so what we're trying to do is to identify which communities and which kefir grains are the ones that are best for particular scenarios, and then to make sure that those get to the people that need them most. And then similarly, there might be another kefir grain or another kimchi or another water kefir or kombucha that's better for, say, dealing with anxiety or IBS or some other sort of symptoms that you need addressed. And so by studying the foods in greater depth and really drilling down into the mechanics and the microorganisms and the metabolites that contribute to health, you can make sure that you're harnessing those optimally going forward.
So talking about all those different health attributes that you mentioned, are there particular strains that pop out straight away when it comes to, say, for instance, for example, anxiety and depression?
Yeah, so in that regard, that's really very new research that we've been undertaking, and we've been doing it with John Cryan, one of my colleagues in APC Microbiome Ireland. So John has an international reputation in the microbiome and gut-brain axis work. So he's in the past focused a lot on individual probiotic strains. And so what we're trying to do now is to look at the more complex communities in fermented foods, whereby my view it's there are some very good probiotics out there, but you have more potential and more metabolic activities when you have consortia or groups of microbes. So instead of one, if you have 5 or 9 or 10 different microbes together, then what they can potentially do is much greater. And so in that regard, we know that some of the lactobacilli and some of the other microbes are very good at, in terms of their things like tryptophan metabolism and producing compounds that are quite like serotonin, which is a brain signaling compound. But what not everybody appreciates is that there are a lot of neuroreceptors in the gut, and so you can impact on your brain health or your mental well-being through what you eat and through the microbes in your gut as well. And so that's really something that John and his colleague Dinan have been pushing for very many years and educating people about. And I think it's really entered into the public consciousness now. And I think now is the perfect time to apply it to fermented foods. And we've done a couple of initial studies, but we're really hoping to ramp that up in the years to come.
Great. I did get a chance to meet Ted a couple of years ago. He's such a lovely man. I actually met him in Paris during one of the conferences, the Gut Brain Axis conference, and actually I had him on the podcast. So if people want to actually want to go back and listen to the whole gut brain connection story from one of the world leaders in that space, the guy that actually coined the term psychobiotic. Go
Yeah,
back and
yeah,
listen to Ted. He's an amazing character, amazing guy.
yeah. I'd highly recommend that. Yeah, he's a great guy, a great speaker, and again, very passionate about his research.
Totally, totally. So I have to ask this question as well. So you mentioned the almost the succession of different bacteria in the dairy medium with all these different microbes, lactobacillus, lactococcus, some yeasts. What's going on when you put those Mik Kefir grains in a coconut medium?
Yeah, so I know that there's a product that's sold in Canada that essentially is doing that. So that's an interesting question in that we've just put out a paper there now where in the last number of days we've sent it for peer review, but we've made it available to the community at large as a pre-peer review document so that people can read about it. And what we've done in that regard is we've studied 58 different fermented foods from around the world, as many weird and wonderful fermented foods as we could get our hands on. And some people might have predicted that we would see the results we did, but I still find them very intriguing. So I maybe take a step back and do a bit of explaining here. So we can do an analysis of the microbiome through DNA-based approaches and kind of quite complex computer-based analysis afterwards. And basically what we're doing is crunching lots of DNA sequence data and tons of data around the microbiome and condensing that down into a single dot on a graph. And what we can do is plot the microbiomes of lots of different fermented foods and see how similar or dissimilar they are. And so we found that all of the kind of dairy-based fermented foods, the kind of cheeses and the nunus and the kefirs, all are somewhat similar because all of the dots kind of go to the similar location on the graph. And we found all of the kind of sugar-based fermented foods are somewhat dissimilar from the dairy foods, but quite somewhat similar to one another. So you're talking about water kefir and kombucha and things like that. And then we had the brine-based foods or the salt fermented foods, which would be kimchi and sauerkraut, and they were kind of in another cluster. And then we had a few kind of hybrids or Frankenstein type foods, which didn't really fall into any one cluster. And so the coconut kefir fell in there. And so it had some of the attributes of a sugar-based fermented food, but a little bit to do with the dairy food as well. And there was kind of a dot out there in its own away from all of the others. And so I guess what you're really doing there is you're putting the kefir grain into a different environment. And so the microbes that might like growing in the dairy environment aren't coping or don't like that environment so much, but maybe other microbes that are in the kefir grain are now saying, this is super, we like this kefir environment, we like the sugars and the different nutrients that are based here, and we're going to grow in this environment. And so those are the microbes that dominate there. And so when you're consuming coconut kefir, you're going to get slightly different microbes, but again, a lot of them are still going to be lactobacillus and others that have at least some suggestion of being health promoting. And so the question then becomes, what are the specific strains doing? And you have to kind of get into deeper human studies to really figure out the specifics. But the type of microbes that are growing are nonetheless suggestive of being able to contribute in some way to good health.
So how do you guys? So I'm assuming you're doing some. Is it PCOA or some sort of analysis to that effect?
How do you mean in terms of the microbiome analysis?
With the clustering.
Or the clustering, yeah. So the PCOA are different types of beta diversity analysis. So basically, microbiologists in recent years, now that we're starting to study microbiome environments, we've robbed a lot of terms from ecologists. So when an ecologist is, say, the analogy that I typically use is that of, say, a rainforest and a desert. So if you're studying the alpha diversity of a food or of a gut environment or something like that, the alpha diversity is where you're comparing, just getting a number relating to how diverse the microbial population of that environment is. So if you think of the Amazon rainforest, you have a high diversity, and if you have the Sahara Desert, you have low diversity. And so that's a number put on each environment. Beta diversity is where you're directly comparing the two, and on that sort of plot, the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert will be on either end of the plot, completely away from each other because there's very little in common, but that the various other different rainforests would all be together in one cluster, and all the different deserts would be in another. And so that, yeah, it's a clustering-based system. And that analogy also serves well to highlight why good microbial diversity or high microbial diversity, especially in the gut, is good, because typically low diversity scenarios have been associated with quite a number of different diseases, whether it be obesity or different allergies, different inflammatory bowel diseases, and so on and so forth. So things that can increase our microbial diversity, such as fermented foods or prebiotics or other interventions, are regarded as being desirable.
Sure. I should let you know, I'm just getting this warning sign coming up on my screen. So if we do cut off, I'll send you a new link straight away so we can get back into it. For some reason it's playing up. So my apologies.
Okay.
So that's fascinating. I agree with you, Paul. Diversity is so important because the microbiome field is relatively young, and scientists like yourself and others are still trying to work things out. But it's interesting that it's almost common sense that an ecosystem like a rainforest or a desert, if there is more diversity, it is more likely that that ecosystem is going to be more resilient. And the way I think about it is that if there is some form of, I don't know, you're going through a period of famine or some sort of crisis, if certain microbes are lacking in the gut because you're missing some prebiotics, you're missing vegetables, or your diet's off, or something's off, you're more likely to get some of these other characters stepping in and filling the void. But if you've got a very small team to play with, there's only so many players that can step up if you need them. So is that similar to what you're talking about, Paul?
Yeah, it's a perfect example. And I quite typically relate back to C. diff infection as being maybe the best example of that whole scenario. So C. diff is quite typically a hospital-acquired infection, but it can occur in other places as well. And C. diff is actually found in very many people's guts. It's a spore former, so a very resilient microorganism. But normally the microbes that we have in our gut keep it in check, and so they produce different metabolites that stop it from growing. But when we're exposed to antibiotics or some other sort of stress, but most typically antibiotics that are used to treat another infection, but also bring about a collateral damage, so inadvertently also do damage to our gut microbes and wipe them out or do significant damage to them, then the removal of those good microbes allow the C. diff to grow. They sporulate and produce toxins, and those toxins give you the severe diarrhea that's associated